All right, good morning, everybody. I'd like to start with a story about trust. About 10 years ago or so, I was working at the Department of Justice in the Justice Department's National Security Division. I had been a career government attorney. I started in the Civil Rights Division a long time ago, and then I spent about 12 years as a federal prosecutor here in Washington, D.C. And at the time, 10 years ago, I was working as the head of the program involved in FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And I had been part of the effort in the department and government-wide to reform FISA during that time, to update it, to bring it in line with new technologies and new challenges. And that led to this landmark legislation some of you may know, referred to as Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Well, my job was to start to implement this new change, and I had a mission which was to go out to Silicon Valley and start to talk to the companies that we were going to be issuing new orders to under this new law. And I flew out from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. I went into one of these companies, a big internet provider company, and I remember walking onto the campus of this company and into one of many buildings in this really beautiful sunlit area to meet with the company's lawyers. And I walked in, first of all, to this workspace. I saw tents and yurts and scooters and dogs. I knew I wasn't in Main Justice anymore, right? And I went to sign in at the kiosk, and there's a tablet there on the kiosk. And where I'm supposed to write my name, enter my name, and I enter my email address. And then there was a space for affiliation. And I was writing, typing in Department of Justice, and I got about halfway through, and the lawyer who I was there to see, the company lawyer, grabbed my arm and stopped me. And I looked at him, and he leaned forward and whispered in my ear, where it says affiliation, just write self. And I can't tell you how jarring that was. He didn't want me to put on there that I was from the Department of Justice. And look, I get it, it wasn't, these lawyers from these companies, and these companies weren't always thrilled to have lawyers from the Justice Department or the intelligence community come out to see them. But I was, I'd spent a career, standing up in court here in the courthouse down the street, proudly saying that I was there on behalf of the United States, that I represented the people of the United States. And I had taken an oath to defend the Constitution. It wasn't part of my experience to think that meeting with a company in Silicon Valley, I couldn't really say that I was from the Department of Justice. It was a very palpable sense of the lack of trust between the government, the federal government, and the technology community. And this was 10 years ago. So here's the thing, right? 5 years after that, it got worse, with the Snowden disclosures. Whatever trust that the government had built up over time was lost overnight. But it wasn't always that way. If you go back to 1957, when the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite into orbit, President Eisenhower reacted. This was our Sputnik moment, right? He created, at that time, the Advanced Research Project Agency, ARPA, later renamed DARPA. Its job was to collaborate, government collaboration with industry and academia, to create new inventions on the very frontiers of technology. And they've made huge breakthroughs, right, in computer networking, the internet, in GPS, in robotics. The very first head of ARPA, a guy named Ron Johnson, left GE $160,000 a year to take that job as the director of ARPA for $18,000. But it wasn't just that was the change, right? It wasn't just that marked that time of collaboration. It was really trust. There was a real trust between the private sector and the government and how to tackle these new challenges around security. But it also wasn't just trust based on blind faith. It was trust based on a sense of common purpose and urgency, and a willingness to work together to take on these security challenges. So, I think today the question is, are we up to this challenge when it comes to cybersecurity? Do we have that sense of urgency, that sense of common purpose, that trust that will allow us to take on these challenges. And you're going to hear today, and you all are very familiar with the challenges we face, whether it's Russian interference in our election, whether it's, we just heard about the things that China is doing in terms of espionage, going after our information and our intellectual property. It includes attacks on our energy grid, destructive attacks that destroy data, take down networks, criminal organizations that carry out attacks, that steal troves of sensitive personal data, ransomware attacks. So you're only too familiar with the threat landscape. So when we think about that threat landscape, increasingly dangerous, increasingly complex, where do we turn? Where do we turn for help? So I think we should look to our experience over the last 18 years fighting terrorism. I spent 3 years leading an organization here in Washington called the National Counterterrorism Center, set up after 9/11. And I can tell you from that experience that there are real lessons to learn, hard-earned lessons to learn from our 18 years in fighting terrorism, in the counterterrorism fight. Let me tick off a few. One, we need to have the expertise to fight in the cybersecurity space. I looked around the room at NCTC, and I saw basically thousands of young people working there and across the intelligence community. They were folks who could have done a lot of different things. They could have gone to Wall Street. They could have gone to Silicon Valley. They chose to fight Al-Qaeda and ISIS. That was their professional calling. We need to have the same sort of commitment when it comes to cybersecurity. I see some of this change occurring now in some of our universities and colleges that are dedicating programs to cybersecurity. There are agencies like the Defense Department creating opportunities to exchange work between the private sector and the government, but we have a long way to go. Some experts say that we'll have 3.5 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs by 2021. So we're a long way from building up that cybersecurity workforce that we need to take on this challenge. We did it in CT. We need to take that same commitment in cybersecurity. Second, we need to think about and commit to information sharing, breaking down those silos of sharing. I mean, everyone talks about this. We had to do it. There was an imperative in counterterrorism after 9/11 to go for it and really commit to sharing information. There was the great lesson of the 9/11 Commission, and the FBI had information about the hijackers, the CIA had information, they didn't share. That failure was in part what led to our inability to detect those attacks. Now, it's even harder when it comes to cybersecurity because it's not just two government agencies sharing information, it's the industry and the government sharing information. And that makes it much harder because their interests, I can tell you from my experience having worked on both sides, their interests are not the same when it comes to how we handle information. But it's only by sharing that information, and I mean sharing granular, near real-time threat information that's going to enable the private sector to protect itself. And the government has to lead here. It has to lead with new laws and policies that protect companies that share information, and it has to lead by example. The new cybersecurity directorate at NSA, I think you'll hear more about that today, is a really strong step in that direction. But this has been a long time in coming, and progress has been too slow, and we need to make more progress more quickly. We don't have the luxury of time. So that's number two, information sharing. Number three, we need to harden our defenses and protect our infrastructure in cybersecurity just like we did in counterterrorism. We really invested in that after 9/11. The government worked with the private sector to develop new technologies for tracking and monitoring terrorists, for hardening our infrastructure. We need the same kind of partnership and collaboration between the government and industry to build the ability to protect the private sector networks that make up 90-some% of our critical infrastructure. Again, as I said, we did this in counterterrorism. We need to make sure that we're doing that same sort of effort in the cyberspace, and that means taking advantages of great innovation around artificial intelligence, big data analytics, high-performance computing. I mean, these changes are taking place. The government needs to further invest in those efforts, but there needs to be a collaboration to make this work. Now, that collaboration and those 3 points on our lessons learned from CT bring me back to sort of the beginning of my talk here, which is, what's the obstacle to all of this? What's standing in the way? And again, I think it's this lack of trust. This lack of trust, this trust deficit that we've had that lingers really post-Snowden from 6 years ago. I think the government has made some strong steps forward in regaining the trust of the American people around intelligence collection. I think it's done a good job in rebuilding our relationships with our allies, but I think it has not gone far enough. We have not gone far enough as a country in regaining that trust between Washington, D.C. and our technology community where so much of this innovation takes place. I mean, there are some positive signs. I would say the transparency efforts by the government, there's been a real strong trend to increase transparency over the past several years. That's a major step forward. We've seen great progress inside the intelligence community, and as well as with private industry in having people move back and forth, right? People go from NSA to work in Silicon Valley. You see more and more people going to work in the government in these areas. It's that sharing of workforce expertise that leads to greater trust. But the problem is, until we really address this issue, until we realize that we are truly all in this together, those steps are not going to be enough. Look, the bad guys don't distinguish between the government and the private sector. They don't distinguish between Equifax and OPM. They are looking for, they're looking for weaknesses that they can exploit. They're looking for ways to get in, whether it's for espionage or for profit. And so that's the reason that we have to realize when it comes to the government and the technology community that we really are all in this together. So as we move forward, as we think about the challenge moving forward, I think we can draw from those lessons from 9/11 and from our counterterrorism fight. And one of those lessons is that cybersecurity is not just about protecting data and systems. Just like counterterrorism, cybersecurity fundamentally is about protecting people. And I think that's a really important insight for all of us who work in this cybersecurity community. It's really about protecting people. So what we need to do is to have innovation and imagination. Remember, the 9/11 Commission talked about a lack of imagination. We need that innovation and we need that imagination, not just in new technologies, but in how we think about the relationships that we've built and how we regain and refoster that trust between the technology community and the government. And with that trust, we can commit to an effort that has that urgency, has that common purpose, and has that sense of mission that will enable us to take on this fight of protecting our security. So you're all maybe out there thinking, this guy is a sort of a hopeless optimist, right? And it's sort of talking about these things and some of these platitudes. But for those of you who are skeptical of my optimism, I will, like some of the other speakers, make a reference. And that reference is, think back to May of this year. And what did we know in May? We knew one thing. We knew that the Nationals were actually in last place. They're not in last place anymore, folks. Go Nats! Thank you all very much.